And just in the way of like this term negative emotions, positive emotions, so maybe everybody's on the same page. Stereotypically, what would be some examples of emotions in those categories?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. Like, what is it that makes an emotion negative? That's kind of a tricky question. So what I do in the book is I pick the ones that I think we're usually the most critical of when we feel them and when other people feel them. So that's going to be emotions like envy or jealousy, contempt might be in that category, maybe spite's in that category, maybe Schadenfreude is in that category, maybe even anger is in that category, depending on who you ask. So I try to pick the ones that I think these are the ones that I feel like we have the most trouble with, in the sense that we really judge ourselves when we feel them, and we also think they're really dangerous maybe when other people feel them.
And I made a note of just a very short sentence you write in the book. When bad feelings happen, just feel them. Seems, obviously very straightforward. Like, why would we do anything otherwise? Could you say a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so it's like that sounds super easy, right? It sounds like really straightforward to just feel them. But we don't do that actually as much as you think. So a lot of times we have a million different kinds of reactions to our negative emotions. So one of them is, I recognize I'm start feeling envious, and I go, oh gosh, I really shouldn't do that. And I try to talk myself out of it really quick. And I say, that's not the right way to feel. I shouldn't feel that way. And so I kind of like judge myself and chastise myself, and I just try to like get rid of it all of a sudden. Sometimes we do things with our negative emotions like we want to turn them into something else. So I'll start feeling envy and I'll go, okay, no, I'm not supposed to feel that. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to channel this into a positive energy. I'm going to, if I'm envious because my neighbor got a new car and I'm like, oh, I'm so jealous of the new car, I will turn my envy into fuel so that I can, save more money or something like that. And I'm going to work harder, and that's going to get me that brand new car, right? I'm going to channel it. Or I start thinking, oh no, I should really change how I'm thinking about this. I should say, oh no, cars aren't really important. And at the end of the day, that's materialism, and I really shouldn't care that much about that. And so rather than just kind of sit with my envy, I'm going to start trying to change my mindset so that I no longer feel it. We do all kinds of things with our negative emotions, I think, because we are really unable to sit with the discomfort that they bring. So it makes us squirm a little bit, I think, to even admit that we feel them. I think envy is like definitely in that category. And we're so quick to just try to either get rid of them, talk ourselves out of them, turn them into something else. We have this real temptation to kind of do things with them rather than just kind of like letting ourselves feel them. I think because we're very afraid that you hear this phrase a lot with negative emotions. Oh, you don't want to feed it. So if you feel it, I think people say, oh, if I let myself feel it though, I'm going to feed the emotion. It's going to get stronger and bigger. It's going to last longer, and then it's going to take over. Right? We have this vision of negative emotions as kind of like monsters or cancers. Like they're things that eat you. They're things that sort of like turn you in. They possess you. We talk about them like kind of turning you into something else. But a lot of that is, I think, this kind of essentially it's a prejudice against negative emotions, that they have all of these scary mystical powers that positive emotions don't have. And so we can't just let ourselves feel them because they're going to do all this scary mystical stuff.
And maybe this is a challenging question or not the greatest question, but like, where does that come from? Is that cultural thing? Is that in the way of just language themselves, of we put negative in front of emotions and then we, create this category? Where does it come from?
That's a really great question. I think there's probably a lot of different sources. I think in the U.S. in particular, there's been this really long tradition of influence from things like the power of positive thinking, right? From like Norman Vincent Peale and that sort of stuff. And there is a real Barbara Ehrenreich has this great book that came out, I think it's like 2005, called Bright-Sided, and it's about this. It's about the sort of like long history of positivity in the U.S. And how powerful and influential it's been in a whole bunch of different sectors. So I think there's this kind of like pro-positivity bias, you might think, particularly in the U.S. Maybe it's other places, but for sure here. People have this sort of view that if you are, if anything bad happens, if there's any stress, sadness, anxiety in your life, then you've failed somehow or something's gone wrong. And that there's this kind of like constant pressure from society to kind of like always look on the bright side, to always try to make sure you're feeling the right kinds of ways, to never get down about stuff. Or if you are, not to stay there, not to do it too long, not to feel it too long. So there's some of it's that. I think some of it too is just we are not great at thinking that maybe there's parts of ourselves that we don't perfectly control. And our emotional life is always presented a little bit of a challenge, I think, to us psychologically, because it is a little bit independent. So we have lots of examples of people who try really hard to stop themselves from feeling something and they can't, or try really hard to make themselves feel something and they don't, or their feelings surprise them or shock them, or you expect to feel one way and you don't feel that way and you don't know what to do about it. I don't think we're very good at sort of accepting that we may not be totally in control of our emotional lives. And so how do we live with a part of ourselves that we don't fully control? I think that's part of what leads us to kind of having these views about these negative emotions as though they're going to take over, because we have this like sort of scary reaction to them because they don't always obey when we want them to. And I think because they don't always obey, we sort of go like, oh, that means they're trouble. And so we've got to do something to kind of control them, rather than just thinking, okay, maybe part of what it means to be a human being is to live with something inside of me that I actually don't control.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And some of these conversations on emotions, which we've done a number of them here on the podcast, can be challenging. I can kind of understand many different sides of the things. I'm a fan of the Stoics for one, and Seneca. I can kind of understand this side, then I can understand the other side, and a figure I love that shows up many times throughout the book, who maybe is okay in this complexity, is Montaigne.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about Montaigne and why he shows up so much throughout the book?
Yeah, he's great. So one of the things that I love about him is that he kind of takes on this tradition in philosophy of thinking that philosophy's job, like when it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, it's supposed to be helping us live well. And he has a complex view about what that means. So, part of what it means is to get some clarity about yourself, right? And to sort of like reflect and introspect and think about you and think about what your commitments are. And philosophy is a way of doing that. And he loves all of the ancient philosophers, right? So like he loves the Stoics and he loves a bunch of those folks. And he uses them as kind of guides for himself when he's trying to understand himself and he's trying to understand his life and think about the challenges that he faces. He turns to them as resources, and he uses them as a bunch of different voices in the conversation about trying to kind of figure this out. And so I love that about him, and I love his he has this way of being really honest about himself, while at the same time not thinking, oh, I'm worthless and terrible. So he doesn't like pump himself up, but he also doesn't rat himself down. And I think that's a great attitude to have when you're trying to kind of understand yourself and you're trying to understand your emotional life. Don't sort of like try to convince yourself you're great, but also don't try to convince yourself you're terrible either. Just kind of like be honest about what's going on inside there. And I think that's a great attitude to have toward our emotions.